There comes a moment in every human life when the familiar world begins to feel like an ill-fitting garment, when the routines that once provided comfort now feel like chains, when the voice that has been whispering in the depths suddenly finds the courage to speak aloud. This is not the restlessness of boredom or the dissatisfaction of unmet desires. This is something far more profound, far more sacred. This is the soul's first cry of recognition, announcing that the time of great transformation has arrived. You feel it first as a stirring in the depths, like the movement of something vast and ancient beneath still waters. The ego, that careful architect of your public self, senses the trembling in its foundations and responds with familiar strategies, busying itself with achievement, surrounding itself with distractions, tightening its grip on the known. But something deeper has awakened, something that cannot be placated with success or silenced with noise. The self, that luminous core of your authentic being, has begun its journey toward consciousness, and nothing will ever be the same. This stirring arrives without fanfare, often disguised as discontent or wrapped in the clothing of midlife questioning. You might find yourself staring at your reflection with a curious sense of estrangement, wondering who this person is who has been living your life. The achievements that once gleamed with promise now feel hollow, like beautiful shells emptied of their living essence. The relationships built on performance rather than presence begin to feel suffocating, demanding energy you no longer possess for maintaining facades you no longer believe in. Jung called this moment enantiodromia, the running counter, the great reversal where psychological energy begins to flow in the opposite direction. What once moved outward toward collective approval now turns inward toward individual truth. What once sought validation in the external world now hungers for authenticity in the internal landscape. This is not regression but progression, not failure but the beginning of becoming. The ancient Greeks understood this phenomenon as the call of the daimon, that guiding spirit which carries our unique destiny. The Romans knew it as genius loci, the spirit of place that calls us home to ourselves. Indigenous cultures speak of the soul's longing to return to its original medicine, its unique gift to the world. Whatever name we give it, the experience is universal. Something within us knows our true nature and will not rest until we embody it fully. This awakening often arrives through the back door of crisis, the job that suddenly feels meaningless, the relationship that reveals its emptiness, the belief system that crumbles under the weight of lived experience. What appears to be breakdown is actually breakthrough, the ego's careful construction giving way to make room for something infinitely more real. Like seeds that require the darkness of soil to germinate, the authentic self often begins its emergence through the fertile darkness of dissolution. You may find yourself drawn to solitude in ways that surprise you, craving silence as a drowning person craves air. The noise of the world, its demands, its expectations, its constant chatter begins to feel like an assault on something tender and newly born within you. This is not antisocial behavior, but soul behavior, the natural response of something authentic trying to find its voice in a world that has taught it to whisper. Dreams may become more vivid, more insistent as the unconscious sends its messengers to the threshold of awareness. Images that make no rational sense begin to carry emotional weight, the locked door that appears night after night, the childhood home revisited in sleep, the unfamiliar figure who seems to know you better than you know yourself. These are not random neurological firings, but the symbolic language of transformation, the psyche's attempt to communicate truths too deep for ordinary words. The body, too, becomes a messenger. Unexplained fatigue may settle into your bones, not the tiredness of physical exertion, but the exhaustion of carrying masks that no longer fit. Tension may gather in places that hold the memory of suppressed truth, the throat that has swallowed too many authentic words, the chest that has held too much unexpressed feeling, the shoulders that have carried too many others' expectations. The body keeps the score of authenticity denied, and now it demands payment. This is the moment when the persona, that carefully crafted public self, begins to feel like a performance you no longer wish to give. The smile that comes automatically in social situations feels painted on. The enthusiasm for activities that once brought pleasure now feels forced, mechanical. You catch yourself going through the motions of a life that seems to belong to someone else, wondering when you became an actor in a play you never auditioned for. Friends and family may notice the change before you fully acknowledge it yourself. They may comment on your distance, your distraction, your sudden disinterest in activities that once engaged you. Some will try to pull you back into the familiar patterns, offering advice or expressing concern about your phase. They mean well, but they cannot understand that you are not having a breakdown. You are having a breakthrough, a breaking through to something more real than the life you have been living. The great turning has begun, and there is no returning to the innocence of unconscious living. You have tasted the fruit of self-awareness, and though the journey ahead is uncertain, the path behind you has already begun to fade. The ego's protests grow louder as it senses its dominion threatened, but something deeper than ego has awakened, something that knows itself to be eternal, essential, and utterly unique. This is the beginning of individuation, Jung's word for the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are. It is a journey that requires the death of who you thought you were supposed to be and the birth of who you actually are. It demands the courage to disappoint others in order to stop disappointing yourself, to appear selfish in order to become genuinely generous, to seem lost in order to find your true direction. The stirring in your depths is the voice of your unlived life, calling you home to yourself. It is the song your soul has been humming since birth, now finally loud enough to hear above the noise of the world. This is not a crisis to be solved, but a calling to be answered, not a problem to be fixed, but a mystery to be lived. The great work of becoming yourself has begun. The chrysalis of transformation is forming around you, and though the process may feel like dissolution, it is actually the beginning of your truest life. Something ancient within you has stirred, something that knows the way even when your conscious mind is lost. Trust this stirring. Follow its guidance. Allow it to lead you home to the self you were always meant to become. The metamorphosis of your soul has begun. The theater of the persona is a magnificent stage, carefully constructed over years of social conditioning, adorned with costumes that fit perfectly into the expectations of others. You have played your roles with dedication, the successful professional, the devoted partner, the responsible child, the helpful friend. Each mask has been lovingly crafted, each performance refined through countless rehearsals in the mirrors of others' approval. But now, in the quiet moments between scenes, you find yourself wondering, who is the actor beneath all these masks? The exhaustion begins subtly, like a slow leak in a tire that leaves you mysteriously deflated without obvious cause. It is not the clean tiredness that comes from honest labor or the sweet fatigue that follows genuine joy. This is the bone-deep weariness of maintaining a self that requires constant vigilance, constant adjustment, constant performance. Your energy drains away not through living but through the endless effort of appearing to live in ways that satisfy everyone except the one person who matters most, the authentic you that waits patiently in the wings. You begin to notice the weight of these masks in ways you never did before. The professional smile that once came so naturally now feels like lifting stone. The enthusiastic agreement that once flowed effortlessly now catches in your throat like a lie trying to pass itself off as truth. The persona that once felt like protection now feels like a prison, beautiful perhaps, but confining nonetheless. Each mask demands its tribute of energy, its sacrifice of spontaneity, its price paid in the currency of authentic expression. This is enantiodromia revealing itself in its gentlest form, not the dramatic reversal of a spiritual crisis, but the gradual turning of a tide that has been flowing in one direction for so long that its reversal feels both strange and inevitable. The energy that once moved outward toward performance begins its slow turn inward toward presence. The attention that once focused on how you appear to others begins to orient itself toward how you feel to yourself. In quiet moments, you catch glimpses of something that has been waiting beneath the performance, a naturalness that needs no rehearsal, an authenticity that requires no maintenance, a presence that simply is without needing to prove itself. It appears in unguarded moments, the laugh that escapes before you remember to modulate it, the opinion that emerges before you think to soften it, the gesture that arises from genuine feeling rather than social appropriateness. These moments of unguarded authenticity feel like coming up for air after being underwater for so long that you had forgotten what breathing felt like. There is a quality of relief so profound that you realize how much effort it has taken to maintain the performance, how much life force has been diverted from living into the exhausting work of appearing to live in acceptable ways. The masks begin to feel not just heavy but foreign, like clothes that belong to someone else that you have been wearing by mistake. The professional persona that once felt like armor now feels like a costume from a play you no longer wish to perform. The social self that once navigated relationships with such skill now feels like a diplomatic translator working overtime to convert authentic feeling into acceptable expression. You find yourself craving moments of transparency, hungering for conversations that move beyond the surface pleasantries into the deeper waters of genuine exchange. Small talk begins to feel like a form of spiritual malnutrition, leaving you hungry even after hours of social interaction. You long for connection that touches the real person beneath the public self. Relationships that can hold the full spectrum of your experience without demanding that you edit it for palatability. This shift from performance to presence is not a rejection of social grace or a descent into selfish authenticity. It is rather a maturing of your relationship with the world, a movement from reactive accommodation to responsive engagement. You begin to distinguish between the kindness that flows from genuine care and the people-pleasing that flows from fear of disapproval. You start to recognize the difference between consideration for others and the self-betrayal that masquerades as consideration. The persona, you realize, was never truly evil. It was a necessary developmental stage, a bridge between the raw authenticity of childhood and the refined genuineness of maturity. Like training wheels on a bicycle, it served its purpose, but now limits the very growth it once facilitated. The masks were scaffolding around the building of your social self, but now the structure is strong enough to stand without external support. As you begin to experiment with showing up more authentically, you discover that the world does not collapse as your ego predicted it would. Some relationships may shift or strain as they encounter your increased genuineness, but others deepen in ways that surprise you. People respond to authentic presence with a relief that mirrors your own, as if they too have been waiting for permission to be more real, more spontaneous, more themselves. You learn to trust the wisdom of your unguarded responses, to honor the intelligence of your immediate reactions before the mind steps in to edit them for social acceptability. This is not about becoming inappropriate or inconsiderate, but about trusting that your authentic self, when expressed with care and consciousness, carries its own natural grace and social intelligence. The transition from performance to presence is like learning to swim after years of carefully constructed flotation devices. There is a moment of terror when you release the familiar supports, a breathless interval when you must trust that something in you knows how to move through the water of human interaction with natural grace. And then, gradually, you discover that presence is not something you must create, but something you must allow. Not a skill to be learned, but a naturalness to be uncovered. The first shift is complete when you realize that being yourself is not a luxury you occasionally afford yourself, but the foundation from which all genuine interaction flows. You understand that authenticity is not selfishness, but generosity, the gift of your real self to a world hungry for genuine human connection. The actor has stepped out of character not to abandon the play, but to discover that life itself is far more interesting than any scripted performance could ever be. In the depths of your psyche, something you have spent years banishing begins to stir. It moves in the corners of your awareness like a figure glimpsed in peripheral vision, familiar yet frightening, known yet denied. This is your shadow, not the evil twin of popular psychology, but the exiled aspects of your wholeness, the parts of yourself that you learn to reject in order to be accepted, to love in order to be loved, to embrace in order to be embraced by a world that taught you to fear your own completeness. The shadow announces itself through projection, that unconscious mechanism by which we cast our disowned qualities onto others and then react with surprising intensity to what we see. The person whose confidence you find arrogant carries your own suppressed boldness. The colleague whose emotional expression you judge as inappropriate holds your own banished feelings. The neighbor whose selfishness irritates you beyond reason mirrors your own unacknowledged needs. What we cannot accept in ourselves, we cannot tolerate in others, and what triggers us most reveals what we have most deeply buried. This recognition arrives like dawn breaking over a landscape you thought you knew, illuminating territories that were always there but remained hidden in the darkness of unconsciousness. The qualities you have spent your lifetime criticizing in others begin to reveal themselves as aspects of your own nature that you learn to despise, to hide, to amputate from your acceptable self-image. The realization is both humbling and liberating. You are not the pure being you imagined yourself to be, but you are also far more complete than you ever dared to hope. The shadow carries not only your darkness, but also your unlived light, the talents you deemed impractical, the dreams you labeled unrealistic, the aspects of yourself that seemed too much, too bright, too powerful for the small life you were told to live. Your rejected confidence slouches in the shadow beside your suppressed anger. Your disowned creativity keeps company with your banished sexuality. Your denied power walks hand in hand with your forbidden wildness. The shadow is not a repository of evil, but a treasure house of wholeness, holding everything you sacrificed on the altar of social acceptability. As you begin to glimpse these exiled parts, the initial reaction is often horror mixed with fascination. The ego, that careful curator of your public image, recoils from this evidence of your multiplicity, your contradictions, your essential humanity. You may feel exposed as if someone has suddenly illuminated a room you thought was safely dark. But this discomfort is the birth pangs of psychological maturity, the growing pains of becoming whole rather than merely good. The work of shadow integration is not about acting out your darker impulses or indulging your rejected aspects without consciousness. It is about recognizing these parts as legitimate dimensions of your humanity that require acknowledgement, not expression. The goal is not to become your shadow, but to become conscious of it, not to be ruled by these disowned aspects, but to include them in your understanding of who you are. This inclusion begins with the radical act of self-compassion, extending to yourself the same understanding you would offer a dear friend who confessed their struggles. You begin to see that the parts of yourself you rejected were not inherently wrong, but simply inconvenient to the image you were trying to maintain or the love you were trying to secure. The anger you buried may have been protecting important boundaries. The sadness you denied may have been honoring real losses. The selfishness you disowned may have been preserving necessary energy. As you practice this compassionate witnessing of your shadow, something remarkable begins to happen. The energy that was locked up in maintaining the repression becomes available for living. The psychological effort that went into keeping parts of yourself in exile can now be redirected toward creative expression, authentic relationship, and genuine growth. You discover that what you thought was protecting your goodness was actually limiting your aliveness. The shadow work reveals itself to be not an exercise in self-criticism, but a homecoming for the parts of yourself that have been waiting in the cold for an invitation back into consciousness. Each acknowledged aspect of your shadow returns not as a conquering enemy, but as a prodigal child, carrying gifts that only it could bring. Your integrated anger becomes healthy assertiveness. Your accepted sadness deepens into genuine compassion. Your owned selfishness matures into appropriate self-care. This integration process unfolds gradually, like a long conversation between estranged family members who are slowly remembering how to be in the same room together. There may be awkward moments, uncomfortable recognitions, times when you feel like a stranger to yourself, as you encounter aspects of your nature that have been foreign for so long. But there is also the profound relief of no longer having to maintain the exhausting vigilance that keeps unwanted parts of yourself at bay. The shadow's embrace is ultimately an act of self-love so radical that it transforms not only how you see yourself, but how you see others. When you can acknowledge your own capacity for pettiness, you become less judgmental of others' small-mindedness. When you own your own potential for cruelty, you develop genuine compassion for human weakness. When you accept your own contradictions, you become more tolerant of the complexity you encounter in relationships. This is the great paradox of shadow work. By accepting what you thought made you bad, you become genuinely good. By embracing what you believed made you unlovable, you become truly lovable. By including what you imagined made you weak, you discover authentic strength. The shadow's embrace is not a descent into darkness, but an ascent into wholeness. Not a corruption of your light, but a completion of your humanity. You realize that the goal was never to become perfect, but to become complete. Never to be without darkness, but to be conscious of it. Never to eliminate your contradictions, but to hold them with grace. The shadow's embrace transforms you from an edited version of yourself into the full, complex, beautifully human being you were always meant to be. The word no sits like a foreign object in your throat, heavy and unfamiliar after years of automatic acquiescence. You have been a person who says yes. Yes to requests that drain you. Yes to demands that diminish you. Yes to invitations into others' dramas while your own life waits patiently in the wings. But something is shifting in the architecture of your soul. Something that recognizes the sacred necessity of walls, the holy purpose of limits, the divine function of selective permeability. For so long you believed that love meant having no boundaries, that goodness required infinite availability, that being spiritual demanded the dissolution of all barriers between yourself and others. You absorbed emotions like a sponge absorbs water unconsciously, completely, without discrimination. Other people's anxiety became your agitation. Their anger transformed into your upset. Their neediness evolved into your guilt. You lived in a state of emotional osmosis, taking in whatever energy surrounded you and calling this sensitivity, calling this compassion, calling this love. But now you begin to understand that this porousness was not love, but a form of self-abandonment, not compassion, but a confusion of boundaries that served no one. You see that by trying to be everything to everyone, you became nothing to yourself. By attempting to hold space for everyone else's feelings, you forgot to make room for your own. By saying yes to every request, you said no to your own deepest needs and truest calling. The recognition arrives with the force of revelation. Boundaries are not walls built to keep love out, but containers designed to keep love in. They are not barriers to intimacy, but the very foundation that makes authentic intimacy possible. Without clear boundaries, relationship becomes enmeshment. Without healthy limits, generosity becomes martyrdom. Without sacred architecture around your essential self, you become a house with no walls, offering shelter to no one because you cannot shelter even yourself. Learning to say no becomes a spiritual practice, each refusal a small act of self-respect, each limit a prayer of self-preservation. The first no feels like swallowing stones, accompanied by familiar voices of guilt and conditioning that whisper of selfishness, of letting others down, of not being good enough. But as you practice this sacred word, something begins to shift in the very foundation of your being. Each boundary you establish creates space for your authentic self to breathe, to grow, to remember what it means to exist without constantly adapting to the needs and expectations of others. You discover that saying no to what depletes you creates space to say yes to what nourishes you. Declining the social obligation that feels heavy opens an evening for solitude that feels sacred. Refusing to absorb someone else's crisis creates capacity to tend your own emotional garden. Setting limits on how much of your energy you give away allows you to discover what you actually want to do with the energy that remains. This boundary setting is not about becoming cold or uncaring, but about becoming clear and conscious. You learn to distinguish between the compassion that flows from fullness and the people-pleasing that flows from emptiness. You begin to recognize the difference between healthy generosity and the compulsive giving that seeks to earn love through service. You develop the ability to offer genuine care without losing yourself in the process. The guilt that accompanies your early boundary-setting efforts is like withdrawal symptoms from an addiction to others' approval. Your system, accustomed to the familiar drug of external validation, rebels against this new sobriety of self-respect. But as you persist in honoring your limits, the guilt gradually gives way to something far more nourishing, the deep satisfaction of integrity, the quiet joy of self-alignment, the profound peace that comes from living in harmony with your own authentic needs. You begin to understand that your energy is not an unlimited resource to be freely distributed, but a sacred trust to be stewarded wisely. You start to see that your emotional capacity is not a bottomless well from which others can drink indefinitely, but a finite gift that requires careful tending. Your time, your attention, your care, these are precious offerings that deserve to be given consciously rather than leaked unconsciously. The people in your life respond to your new boundaries with varying degrees of understanding. Some may protest, having grown accustomed to your unlimited availability. Others may test your limits, pushing against your newfound clarity to see if it will hold. But those who truly love you will respect your boundaries because they recognize that a boundaried person is capable of genuine intimacy in ways that a boundaryless person never can be. As your boundaries strengthen, you discover an unexpected paradox. The more clearly you define where you end and others begin, the more freely you can love. When you know that you will not lose yourself in relationship, you can risk real intimacy. When you trust that you will not be consumed by others' emotions, you can offer genuine empathy. When you are certain that your own needs will not be forgotten, You can attend to others' needs with pure generosity rather than resentful obligation. Your boundaries become the sacred architecture of your authentic self. Not walls that isolate you from love, but structures that make love possible. They create the container within which your truest nature can flourish. The temple walls that protect the holy fire of your essential being from the winds of others' expectations and demands. This third shift transforms you from a person who exists in reaction to others' needs into someone who responds from a place of conscious choice. You move from unconscious accommodation to intentional engagement, from automatic yes to discerning consideration. Your boundaries become not barriers to connection, but the very foundation upon which genuine connection becomes possible. You learn that the most loving thing you can do is to show up as your authentic self, rather than as the endless accommodator you once believed love required you to be. The emotions you have spent years polishing, editing, and presenting in socially acceptable forms begin to reveal themselves as messengers from the depths, carriers of intelligence from realms your rational mind cannot access. For too long, you have treated your feelings like unruly children to be managed, rather than wise teachers to be consulted, like symptoms to be medicated, rather than signals to be decoded, like inconveniences to be minimized rather than essential aspects of your humanity to be honored. You realize that you have been living with a carefully curated emotional landscape, displaying only the feelings that made others comfortable while banishing the rest to the underground caverns of your psyche. Joy was acceptable if it wasn't too exuberant. Sadness was permitted if it didn't last too long. Anger was forbidden unless it could be justified by clear moral grounds. Fear was shameful unless it was rational. Love was welcome unless it was too intense, too inconvenient, too disruptive to the careful order of your constructed life. But now something is changing in the way you relate to the full spectrum of your emotional experience. You begin to sense that your feelings are not random chemicals flooding your system, but messengers carrying vital information from the unconscious realms of your being. Each emotion arrives bearing news from territories of yourself that your conscious mind rarely visits, bringing reports from the frontier where your soul meets the world. Anger, that emotion you learned to fear and suppress, begins to reveal itself as the guardian of your boundaries, the fierce protector of your values, the internal alarm system that sounds when something sacred within you has been violated. You discover that your anger is not evidence of your failure to be spiritual, but proof of your commitment to what matters most deeply to you. It carries information about your limits, your needs, your non-negotiables, intelligence that no amount of rational analysis could provide. Sadness, which you once treated like an unwelcome visitor, to be hurried away as quickly as possible, shows itself to be the heart's natural response to loss, the soul's way of honoring what was precious and is now gone. You learn that sadness is not depression but depth, not weakness but the courage to feel fully the weight of what it means to love in a world where everything beloved is temporary. Your tears become not signs of breakdown but evidence of your capacity for profound connection. Fear, that emotion you were taught to overcome and transcend, reveals itself as wisdom dressed in anxiety's clothing, as intuition speaking in the language of concern. You begin to distinguish between the neurotic fears born of past trauma and the organic fears that arise as guidance from your deeper knowing. This discernment allows you to honor fear as a compass, pointing toward both danger to be avoided and growth that requires courage to embrace. Even jealousy, that emotion you learned to be ashamed of, begins to show its hidden face as a teacher pointing toward unmet needs, unexpressed desires, unlived aspects of yourself seeking recognition. Rather than pushing it away in moral superiority, You learn to ask what this feeling is trying to tell you about what you long for, what you value, what you fear losing or never having. This emotional honesty requires a fundamental shift in your relationship with feeling itself. Instead of immediately moving to change, fix, or escape uncomfortable emotions, you learn the radical practice of simply being with them, of offering them the same hospitable presence you would offer a friend who came to you in distress. You discover that emotions, when met with consciousness rather than resistance, have their own natural rhythms, their own organic intelligence, their own capacity for transformation. The practice of emotional honesty extends beyond your private relationship with your feelings into the realm of authentic communication. You begin to risk sharing your actual emotional experience rather than the edited version you once believed was more palatable. This vulnerability feels initially like walking naked into a public square, exposed and undefended. But gradually you discover that emotional honesty invites emotional honesty, that your willingness to be real gives others permission to be real, that authentic feeling shared creates bonds far deeper than pleasant superficialities ever could. You learn to speak from your emotions rather than about them, to say, "I feel angry," rather than, "You make me angry," to own your experience rather than projecting it onto others. This shift from blame to responsibility, from reactivity to responsiveness, transforms not only how you communicate, but how you experience relationship itself. Conflict becomes conversation, disagreement becomes dialogue, emotional turbulence becomes the raw material for deeper understanding. The alchemy of emotional honesty transforms the lead of suppressed feeling into the gold of authentic expression. What once felt heavy and burdensome becomes light and flowing. What once seemed dangerous and destructive reveals itself as creative and life-giving. Your emotions become not problems to be solved, but energies to be channeled, not weaknesses to be hidden, but strengths to be expressed, not chaos to be controlled, but wisdom to be trusted. This emotional authenticity ripples outward into every area of your life. Work becomes more than performance when you can bring your genuine enthusiasm or acknowledge your real concerns. Relationships deepen when you can share your actual feelings rather than the feelings you think you should have. Creativity flows more freely when you allow your authentic emotional responses to inform your choices and expressions. The fourth shift is complete when you realize that your emotions are not obstacles to your spiritual growth, but vehicles for it, not evidence of your humanity's limitation, but proof of its magnificent complexity. You understand that feeling fully is not the opposite of thinking clearly, but its essential complement, that emotional honesty is not self-indulgence, but self-respect, that honoring your feelings is not weakness, but the foundation of authentic strength. You discover that you were never meant to transcend your emotions, but to transform your relationship with them, to become not someone who doesn't feel, but someone who feels consciously, not someone above the human experience, but someone fully embodying it with awareness, grace, and profound respect for the intelligence that flows through every authentic feeling. There comes a moment in the journey of becoming authentic when you must face one of the ego's most cherished illusions, the belief that you can be loved by everyone, that universal approval is not only possible, but necessary for your survival. This fantasy, woven into the very fabric of your conditioned self, begins to unravel as you recognize the impossible mathematics of trying to be all things to all people. The people-pleaser within you, that tireless diplomat who has spent years negotiating treaties between your authentic self and others' expectations, finally lays down its arms in exhausted surrender. The compulsion to be liked by everyone is not born of love, but of fear, the primal terror of abandonment that whispers that rejection equals death. that disapproval means exile from the tribe, that someone's dislike of you is evidence of your fundamental unworthiness. This fear drives you to contort yourself into shapes that fit others' needs, to edit your truth until it becomes palatable to every possible audience, to sacrifice your authentic expression on the altar of universal acceptance. But the mathematics of people-pleasing never add up. Each person you encounter carries their own complex web of preferences, triggers, projections, and expectations. What delights one person offends another. What one finds endearing, another finds irritating. What seems like kindness to some appears as weakness to others. The attempt to satisfy everyone becomes a futile exercise in shape-shifting that leaves you exhausted and empty, performing endless variations of yourself, while losing touch with who you actually are beneath all the adaptations. The death of people-pleasing begins with a moment of clarity so stark it takes your breath away. You realize that the approval you have been so desperately seeking is not actually about you at all. Others' opinions of you are filtered through their own wounds, their own conditioning, their own projections and unhealed places. Their like or dislike has less to do with your inherent worth and more to do with how you interact with their own complex inner landscape. You are not actually being seen and judged. You are being used as a screen upon which others project their own stories, their own fears, their own unmet needs. This recognition is both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it reveals the futility of your lifelong strategy for securing love and belonging. Liberating because it frees you from the impossible task of trying to control others' perceptions and reactions. You begin to understand that being disliked by some people is not a failure but an inevitability, not a judgment on your worth but a natural consequence of being a specific person with specific qualities rather than a generic placeholder designed to offend no one. The fear of disapproval that once drove your people-pleasing behavior begins to lose its power as you recognize its origins in childhood wounds and survival strategies that no longer serve your adult self. You see how the approval-seeking that once protected you from abandonment now prevents you from experiencing genuine connection. By trying to be acceptable to everyone, you become truly known by no one. By attempting to avoid all conflict, you avoid all intimacy. By seeking universal like, you forfeit particular love. As you begin to risk showing up as your authentic self, something remarkable happens. The people who matter most respond with relief and appreciation rather than rejection. They had been waiting for the real you all along, sensing something inauthentic in your people-pleasing performances, but not knowing what was missing until you finally appeared. Your willingness to be disliked by some creates space to be genuinely loved by others, not for who you pretend to be, but for who you actually are. The relationships that cannot survive your authenticity reveal themselves to have been built on sand rather than stone, dependent on your self-betrayal rather than your true self. These connections may fall away as you stop performing the version of yourself they required, and this loss may initially feel like confirmation of your worst fears. But what emerges in their place are relationships of substance, connections that can hold the full spectrum of who you are, without requiring you to edit or diminish yourself. You discover that being genuinely liked by a few is infinitely more nourishing than being superficially approved of by many. The quality of connection that becomes possible when you stop trying to be universally acceptable creates a richness of relationship you never knew was possible. When you can trust that you will not abandon yourself for others' comfort, you can risk the vulnerability that true intimacy requires. The death of people-pleasing is not a descent into selfishness, but an ascent into authentic generosity. When you stop giving from obligation and start giving from genuine desire, Your contributions to others become more valuable rather than less. When you cease helping from compulsion and begin helping from choice, your service becomes more meaningful rather than diminished. When you quit accommodating from fear and start accommodating from love, your care becomes more genuine rather than less real. This shift transforms your relationship not only with others, but with yourself. The internal critic that once monitored your every word and gesture for signs of potential disapproval begins to quiet as you recognize that its vigilance was based on a false premise. You no longer need constant surveillance of your own behavior because you are no longer trying to be someone you are not. The exhausting internal dialogue about whether you said the right thing, did the right thing, appeared. The right way begins to subside as you accept that being your authentic self is enough. The fifth shift is complete when you realize that the love worth having is the love that can embrace your full humanity, your light and your shadow, your strengths and your limitations, your wisdom and your folly. You understand that being disliked for who you are is preferable to being liked for who you are not. That authentic rejection is more valuable than false acceptance. That disappointing others by being yourself is better than disappointing yourself by being someone else. The people pleaser dies so that the authentic person can be born, and in this death and rebirth, you discover that you were never meant to be loved by everyone. You were meant to be truly known and genuinely cherished by those capable of seeing and appreciating the irreplaceable gift of your authentic self. Between the lightning strike of trigger and the thunder of action lies a sacred space, a pause pregnant with possibility, a moment where choice lives and freedom is born. For most of your life, you have been a creature of reaction, your responses as automatic as reflexes, your behaviors as predictable as the pathwater takes down a hillside. But now, in this season of awakening, you begin to discover the profound difference between reacting and responding, between being lived by your conditioning and living from your consciousness. The reactive self operates from the ancient brain, that primitive survival mechanism that served your ancestors well when saber-toothed tigers prowled the landscape, but serves you poorly in the complex emotional terrain of modern relationships. This part of you experiences every criticism as an attack, every disagreement as a threat, every unexpected change as a crisis requiring immediate defensive action. It knows only fight, flight, or freeze, the three options of a nervous system convinced that survival hangs in the balance of every human interaction. You begin to notice the patterns of your reactivity, like a naturalist observing the behavior of some fascinating but predictable species. When someone questions your decision, you automatically defend. When someone expresses disappointment, you immediately blame. When someone withdraws their affection, you instantly pursue or punish. These responses arise so quickly, they seem to bypass consciousness entirely, as if some autopilot has taken control of your emotional airplane and is flying familiar routes to familiar destinations, none of which are where you actually want to go. The awakening to this unconscious dance begins with the simple but revolutionary practice of noticing, becoming aware of the gap between stimulus and response that always exists but usually passes unrecognized. This gap is like the space between musical notes that allows melody to emerge from noise, the pause between breaths that makes speech possible, the interval between heartbeats that sustains life itself. In this space, you discover something remarkable. You have a choice. This choice is not always easy to access at first. Years of conditioning have worn grooves in your psyche like water-carving channels in stone, and your responses tend to flow along these familiar pathways with the momentum of habit. But as you practice expanding the pause between trigger and action, you begin to discover that even a few seconds of conscious breathing can transform your entire response to challenging situations. In this sacred pause, you learn to ask different questions. Instead of, how can I defend myself? You begin to wonder, what is this situation trying to teach me? Instead of, how can I make this person understand? You start to inquire, what would love do here? Instead of, how can I control this outcome? You begin to explore, how can I respond from my highest self rather than my wounded self? The transformation from reaction to response is like the difference between being a pinball bouncing off bumpers and being a conscious navigator choosing your course. When you react, you are at the mercy of external circumstances, your peace dependent on others' behavior, your happiness contingent on things going according to your expectations. When you respond, you become the author of your own experience, able to choose your attitude, regardless of circumstances, capable of maintaining your center, even when the world around you spins in chaos. This shift requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold the tension between opposing forces without immediately collapsing into one side or the other. When someone criticizes you, instead of automatically defending or attacking, you learn to hold both the sting of their words and your own inherent worth, allowing a third option to emerge that serves the highest good of all involved. When faced with disappointment, instead of immediately falling into despair or denial, you hold both the reality of what happened and the possibility of growth, creating space for wisdom to arise. The practice of conscious responding begins in small moments. The pause before answering the phone when you're feeling reactive. The breath you take before responding to a challenging email. The moment of silence you allow before defending yourself in an argument. These tiny intervals of consciousness accumulate like compound interest, gradually expanding your capacity to choose wisdom over woundedness, love over fear, growth over self-protection. As you develop this skill, you begin to notice that your relationships transform. People respond differently to you when you stop reacting to their provocations, when you refuse to dance the familiar steps of unconscious interaction. Your non-reactivity creates space for others to examine their own patterns. Your conscious responses invite them into deeper levels of communication than they may have experienced before. You discover that most conflicts are not actually about the surface issues they appear to address, but about deeper needs for understanding, respect, safety, or connection. When you can respond from this deeper level, rather than reacting to surface provocations, conversations shift from battlegrounds to meeting grounds, from competitions to collaborations in mutual understanding. The mastery of response over reaction extends beyond interpersonal relationships into your relationship with life itself. You begin to meet unexpected changes with curiosity rather than resistance, to greet challenges as opportunities for growth rather than evidence of life's unfairness, to embrace uncertainty as the natural state of a universe in constant creative flux rather than a problem to be solved. This sixth shift is complete when you realize that freedom is not the absence of difficult circumstances, but the presence of conscious choice within whatever circumstances arise. You understand that peace is not dependent on external conditions, but on your capacity to respond from your centered self, rather than your triggered self. That happiness is not the result of getting what you want, but of choosing wisdom in how you relate to what you receive. You become a master of the pause, a practitioner of the sacred gap between stimulus and response, a conscious participant in the dance of life rather than an unconscious victim of circumstance. In this mastery, you discover that you are far more powerful than you ever imagined, not the power to control life, but the power to choose how you meet it. There comes a moment in the journey toward authenticity when you realize that the questions you have been asking have been leading you away from yourself rather than toward yourself, away from truth rather than toward it, away from fulfillment rather than toward it. For years, your internal dialogue has been dominated by a particular set of inquiries, so familiar you barely recognize them as questions at all. What do they want from me? How can I meet their expectations? What will make them happy? How can I avoid disappointing them? These questions, born from the conditioned mind's desperate attempt to secure love and belonging, have been the invisible architects of your choices, the silent directors of your life's script. But now, in this season of awakening, a fundamental reorientation begins to occur in the very questions that guide your existence. Like a compass needle swinging from magnetic north to true north, your inquiry begins to shift from external validation to internal guidance, from others' approval to your own authenticity, from collective expectations to individual calling. This shift in questioning marks nothing less than a revolution in the source of your authority, a transfer of power from the outside world to the wisdom that dwells within. The old questions that once seemed so important begin to reveal their limitations, their capacity to lead you into increasingly smaller versions of yourself. What do others want from me? Assumes that your value lies in your ability to fulfill others' needs, rather than in your inherent worth. How can I avoid disappointing them? Presupposes that others' disappointment is more significant than your own self-betrayal. What will make them happy? Implies that others' happiness is your responsibility, while your own happiness remains secondary or irrelevant. As you begin to recognize the imprisoning nature of these externally focused inquiries, new questions begin to emerge from the depths of your being, questions that carry the fragrance of freedom, the resonance of truth, the magnetic pull of authentic direction. What does my soul require becomes the foundational inquiry that reorients your entire approach to decision-making. This question assumes that you have an inner wisdom worth consulting, a deeper self worth honoring, a unique path worth following. What would I choose if I weren't afraid of others' reactions? Opens doorways to possibilities you had never allowed yourself to consider. This inquiry reveals how much of your life has been shaped not by your authentic desires, but by your fear of others' judgments. How many opportunities you have declined, not because they didn't appeal to you, but because they might not appeal to those whose approval you sought. What wants to emerge through me invites you to consider yourself not merely as someone who responds to external demands, but as a channel through which something unique and valuable seeks expression. This question transforms you from a passive reactor to an active collaborator with the creative force that moves through your life, recognizing that you have gifts to offer that no one else can give, perspectives to share that arise from your particular intersection of experience and insight. What would love do here becomes a compass for navigating complex situations, pointing not toward what would be easiest or most popular, but toward what would serve the highest good of all involved, including yourself. This question assumes that love is not self-sacrifice, but intelligent compassion, not the abandonment of your needs, but the integration of your well-being with the well-being of others. The transformation in your questioning creates a ripple effect throughout every area of your life. Career decisions that once centered around security and others' expectations begin to include considerations of meaning, creativity, and authentic contribution. Relationship choices that once focused on others' approval begin to include your own happiness, compatibility, and mutual growth. Daily decisions that once asked, "What should I do?" begin to ask, "What wants to happen?" allowing space for spontaneity, intuition, and organic unfolding. This shift in inquiry requires courage because the questions that arise from your authentic self often lead to answers that challenge the status quo of your life. The job that provides security but numbs your soul. The relationship that looks good on paper but feels empty in practice. The lifestyle that meets others' definitions of success but leaves you feeling hollow. The new questions illuminate these discrepancies with uncomfortable clarity, demanding honest acknowledgement of the gap between the life you are living and the life that wants to live through you. As you practice asking these transformative questions, you discover that they have their own intelligence, their own capacity to guide you toward experiences and opportunities that align with your deepest truth. Unlike the old questions that sought to eliminate risk and guarantee approval, these new inquiries lead you into the unknown territories where growth lives, where creativity flourishes, where your unique contribution to the world awaits discovery. The process of question transformation is like archaeological work, excavating your authentic desires from beneath layers of conditioning and expectation. Each genuine inquiry uncovers another aspect of who you really are beneath who you were taught to be, revealing preferences you didn't know you had, dreams you had forgotten you carried, values you had learned to suppress in favor of more acceptable alternatives. The seventh shift reaches completion when you realize that the quality of your questions determines the quality of your life, that the inquiries you make to yourself and to existence itself shape the experiences you have access to. You understand that asking, "What do others want from me?" will always lead to a life lived in service to others' agendas, while asking, "What does my soul require?" opens the door to a life lived in service to your deepest truth. You become an archaeologist of your own authenticity, a detective of your own desires, a philosopher of your own experience. The questions that once imprisoned you in others' expectations now liberate you into your own possibilities, transforming you from someone who seeks answers outside yourself to someone who trusts the wisdom that arises from within when the right questions are asked with sincere openness to whatever truth emerges. In a world that equates being alone with being lonely, that mistakes solitude for isolation, that fears silence as emptiness, you begin to discover one of life's most profound secrets: the difference between the loneliness that comes from disconnection and the richness that comes from communion with yourself. What you once avoided as a state of deprivation reveals itself as a sanctuary of replenishment. What you once fled as abandonment becomes a homecoming to your own essential nature. For years, you may have filled every quiet moment with noise, every empty space with activity, every pause with distraction. The thought of being alone with yourself felt dangerous, as if without the buffer of others' presence or external stimulation, you might encounter something unbearable. Your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own unedited existence. Solitude felt like punishment rather than privilege, like exile rather than sanctuary, like poverty rather than wealth. But now, as you shed the false identities that required an audience to maintain, as you release the need for constant external validation, as you learn to trust your own inner compass, something remarkable begins to happen. The prospect of being alone starts to feel not like deprivation, but like liberation, not like emptiness, but like fullness, not like isolation, but like the most intimate form of connection possible, connection with your own soul. This transformation of solitude from burden to blessing does not happen overnight. It requires patience as you learn to sit with yourself without immediately reaching for your phone, without turning on music, without finding some task to occupy your attention. The initial discomfort is like withdrawal symptoms from an addiction to external stimulation, your nervous system habituated to the constant input of others' energy, others' needs, others' expectations. In the early stages of embracing solitude, you may encounter what feels like silence, but is actually the noise of your own mind, finally audible, without competing sounds. The endless commentary, the judging voice, the worried thoughts, the planning and rehearsing and reviewing, all of this mental chatter that was always there, but drowned out by external activity, now rises to the surface of your awareness, like sediment settling to the bottom of a jar when the water finally stops being stirred. But as you persist in spending time alone, as you resist the urge to immediately fill the space with distraction, something deeper begins to emerge. Beneath the surface noise of mental activity, beneath the habitual patterns of thought and worry, beneath the conditioned responses that have been running your life, you begin to encounter the voice that speaks only when the world grows still. Your own authentic voice, the voice of your deepest knowing, the voice that has been waiting patiently for your attention all along. This voice does not speak in the language of shoulds and musts, does not echo the voices of your parents or teachers or society's expectations. It speaks in the language of intuition, of organic knowing, of truth that arises not from analysis, but from the deeper intelligence of your being. It knows things your rational mind cannot figure out, sees solutions your thinking mind cannot devise, offers guidance that bypasses the limitations of logic and speaks directly from the wisdom of your experience. In solitude, you begin to distinguish between being alone and being lonely, recognizing that loneliness is not about the absence of others, but about the absence of connection, and that the most fundamental connection is the one with yourself. You discover that you can be lonely in a crowded room if you are disconnected from your own experience, and deeply fulfilled in solitude when you are present to your own being. The quality of silence changes as you learn to inhabit it rather than endure it. What once felt empty begins to feel pregnant with possibility. What once seemed like nothingness reveals itself to be fullness, not the fullness of stimulation, but the fullness of presence, not the fullness of activity, but the fullness of being, not the fullness of doing, but the fullness of simply existing in conscious awareness of your own existence. In this sacred solitude, creativity begins to stir, ideas that could never emerge in the midst of social activity, insights that require the spaciousness of quiet to form, inspirations that arise only when the mind is not occupied with response and reaction. All of these begin to surface like flowers blooming in a garden that has finally been given the conditions it needs to flourish. You begin to understand that solitude is not the absence of relationship, but a different kind of relationship. Relationship with the parts of yourself that only emerge when they feel safe, when they feel invited, when they feel honored. The shy aspects of your creativity, the tender places in your heart, the wise voice of your intuition. All of these require the protected space of solitude to reveal themselves fully. This alone time becomes as essential as food or sleep, not a luxury you allow yourself when everything else is done, but a necessity you prioritize because you recognize its role in maintaining your psychological and spiritual health. You learn to protect your solitude as fiercely as you once protected your social calendar, to defend your quiet time as vigilantly as you once defended your commitments to others. The eighth shift transforms your relationship with yourself from something you visit occasionally to something you inhabit regularly, from a relationship you maintain through others to a relationship you cultivate directly. You become your own best company, not because you don't enjoy others, but because you have learned to enjoy yourself. Not because you don't need people, but because you no longer need people to tell you who you are. In the sanctuary of solitude, you remember the face you wore before the world taught you to perform, the voice you spoke with before you learned to edit it for others' comfort, the dreams you dreamed before you learned to shape them to fit others' expectations. You discover that being alone is not a consolation prize for those who cannot find companionship, but a gift available to those courageous enough to receive it. The hermit within you awakens, not the hermit who withdraws from life, but the hermit who periodically withdraws to life, who understands that external engagement becomes richer when it flows from internal fullness, who knows that you cannot give what you do not have, and cannot love others authentically until you have learned to love yourself genuinely. Solitude becomes not an escape from relationship, but preparation for relationship, not avoidance of connection, but the foundation that makes authentic connection possible. In learning to be alone without being lonely, you discover the secret of being with others without losing yourself. Something wild and untamed begins to stir within you, something that cannot be contained by the neat categories of your rational mind or the careful boundaries of your controlled life. It moves like wind through trees, like water finding its way downhill, like fire seeking fuel, natural, unstoppable, and utterly essential to your authentic being. This is creativity awakening, not as a luxury for the artistically gifted, but as the fundamental force through which your soul seeks to express its unique truth in the world. For too long, you may have believed that creativity was the domain of a chosen few, that artistic expression required special talent or training, that the urge to create was somehow frivolous or impractical in the serious business of adult life. But now you begin to recognize creativity not as a specialty skill, but as a birthright, not as an optional extra, but as essential as breathing, not as something you do, but as something you are, a creative being having a human experience, a unique expression of the universe's infinite capacity for novelty and beauty. This creative awakening often begins subtly, as an increasing dissatisfaction with purely consumptive activities. The endless scrolling through others' creations begins to feel empty. The passive entertainment that once filled your evenings starts to feel numbing rather than nourishing. Something within you grows restless for expression rather than impression, for creation rather than consumption, for making rather than taking in. You may find yourself drawn to activities you haven't engaged in since childhood. The urge to pick up a paintbrush, to write in a journal, to sing in the car, to rearrange your living space, to cook without following a recipe. These impulses arise not from any external pressure or goal, but from an internal recognition that your soul has something to say and is seeking vehicles through which to speak. This is what Jung called the transcendent function in its creative aspect, the psyche's capacity to generate new forms of expression that bridge the conscious and unconscious realms. Your creativity becomes a translator, converting the wordless knowing of your deeper self into forms that can be shared, witnessed, and appreciated. Through creative expression, the invisible becomes visible, the unspoken becomes articulate, the formless finds form. The creative process reveals itself to be less about producing masterpieces and more about engaging in a conversation with mystery. Each brushstroke, each written word, each musical phrase, each dance movement becomes a question posed to the unknown, an invitation for something beyond your conscious mind to participate in the creative process. You discover that the most satisfying creative experiences occur not when you are controlling the outcome, but when you are collaborating with forces larger than your individual will. This creativity is not limited to traditional artistic mediums. It expresses itself in the way you arrange flowers in a vase, in the conversations you craft with friends, in the meals you prepare with attention and care, in the way you organize your workspace, in the manner you dress to express your inner state, in the unique perspective you bring to problem solving in your daily life. Creativity becomes a way of being rather than merely a thing you do, an approach to existence that recognizes every moment as an opportunity for conscious creation. As you begin to honor these creative impulses, you encounter the resistance that has kept your creative self in hiding. the inner critic that judges your efforts before they are even complete, the perfectionist that paralyzes you with impossible standards, the practical voice that questions the value of anything that doesn't produce immediate, measurable results. These internal voices, often echoes of external messages you received about the impracticality or frivolity of creative pursuits, must be acknowledged and gently but firmly set aside. The practice of creativity requires a different kind of courage than many other aspects of authentic living. It demands the willingness to be seen in your amateur attempts, to create things that may not be good by external standards, but are authentic expressions of your inner world. It requires the courage to play, to experiment, to fail beautifully, to make messes in service of discovery. Through regular creative practice, you begin to notice that creativity has its own rhythm, its own seasons of flow and rest, its own mysterious timing that cannot be forced or controlled. You learn to trust the fallow periods when inspiration feels distant, understanding them as necessary interludes in the creative cycle rather than evidence of creative death. You discover that creativity is not a resource that depletes with use, but a capacity that expands through exercise. The act of creating becomes a form of meditation, a practice of presence that draws you fully into the current moment. When you are truly engaged in creative expression, time becomes fluid, self-consciousness dissolves, and you enter what psychologists call the flow state, that optimal experience where action and awareness merge, where the boundary between self and activity disappears, where you become a pure channel for creative energy. This creative engagement transforms your relationship with imperfection and uncertainty. In the creative process, mistakes become discoveries, unexpected outcomes become new directions, and the unknown becomes a playground rather than a threat. You learn to embrace the messy, non-linear nature of creative unfolding, finding beauty in the process itself rather than demanding perfection in the product. The ninth shift is complete when you recognize that your life itself is your greatest creative work, that every choice you make is a brushstroke on the canvas of your existence. That authenticity is the ultimate creative act. You understand that creativity is not separate from spirituality, but is spirituality in action, not separate from love, but is love expressed through form, not separate from truth, but is truth made manifest in the physical world. You become a co-creator with life itself, no longer just responding to circumstances, but actively participating in the ongoing creation of reality. Your creativity becomes a bridge between your inner world and the outer world, a means of making your invisible truth visible, your silent wisdom audible, your unique perspective tangible. In embracing creativity as your soul's native language, you discover that you have been in conversation with the creative force of the universe all along. Now you simply learn to speak more fluently, to listen more attentively, and to trust more completely in the creative intelligence that flows through you and seeks expression in forms that only you can give it. In the tender geography of your soul, there exists a place that has known profound hurt, a wound so deep it has shaped the landscape of your inner world, influenced the paths you have chosen, and colored the lens through which you view yourself and others. For years, you may have tried to heal this wound, to close it, to pretend it doesn't exist, to transcend it through spiritual practice or positive thinking. But now, in this season of deep authenticity, you begin to discover one of life's most paradoxical truths. Your deepest wound is not something to be healed, but something to be honored, not an obstacle to your gifts, but the very source of them. This sacred wound carries many faces across the spectrum of human experience. It may be the abandonment that taught you to become hypervigilant about love's reliability, the betrayal that awakened your capacity to recognize truth from deception, the rejection that developed your sensitivity to others' unspoken pain, the loss that opened your heart to the preciousness of what remains, the trauma that gave you access to resilience you never knew you possessed. Whatever form it takes, this wound has been your unwelcome teacher, your uninvited guest, your persistent shadow companion on the journey of becoming who you are. The relationship between wound and gift is not accidental but alchemical. The specific nature of your deepest hurt creates the precise conditions necessary for your unique contribution to emerge. Like pressure transforming coal into diamond, like fire refining gold, like breaking open revealing the seed's potential, your wound has been the crucible in which your most precious gifts have been forged. The very experiences that seem to diminish you have actually been preparing you to serve others who walk similar paths of struggle and healing. This recognition often arrives as a shock to the system that has spent so much energy trying to move beyond the wound, to put it in the past, to declare it healed and done. You realize that your attempts to transcend your wound were actually attempts to transcend your gifts, that your efforts to become someone who had never been hurt were efforts to become someone who could never truly help others who are hurting. The wounded healer archetype awakens within you, not the helper who has moved beyond their wounds, but the one who has learned to transform their wounds into wisdom, their pain into compassion, their struggles into strength that can be shared with others. You begin to understand that your credibility as a healer, teacher, friend, or guide comes not from your perfection, but from your willingness to acknowledge and integrate your imperfection. Not from having all the answers, but from having lived authentically with the questions. This shift requires a fundamental reframing of what healing means. Instead of healing as the elimination of the wound, you discover healing as the integration of the wound's gifts. Instead of healing as forgetting what happened, you find healing as transforming what happened into wisdom. Instead of healing as transcending your human limitations, you recognize healing as embracing those limitations as the very source of your capacity to connect with and serve others. The sacred wound becomes a doorway rather than a wall, a bridge rather than a barrier, a source of connection rather than separation. Your experience of abandonment allows you to recognize and comfort the abandoned child in others. Your encounter with betrayal gives you the ability to help others navigate the treacherous waters of broken trust. Your intimacy with loss enables you to sit with others in their grief without trying to fix or rush their process. You begin to notice how the people who have helped you most in your own healing journey were not those who had never experienced your particular form of suffering, but those who had walked through similar darkness and emerged with their compassion intact. Their wisdom deepened, their capacity for empathy expanded. They could sit with your pain without being overwhelmed by it because they had learned to sit with their own pain. They could offer hope without false optimism because they had found genuine reasons for hope within their own struggles. This understanding transforms your relationship with others who are suffering. Instead of trying to fix them or save them from their pain, you learn to accompany them through it, to be present with their process, rather than attempting to accelerate their healing, to trust their capacity for growth even when they cannot see it themselves. Your wound has taught you that healing cannot be rushed, that some lessons can only be learned through direct experience, that the attempt to bypass pain often prolongs it. The sacred wound also reveals itself as a source of authenticity that cannot be manufactured or imitated. The depth of your compassion, the quality of your presence, the genuineness of your empathy, these arise not from techniques you have learned, but from territories of suffering you have inhabited and transformed. Your wound gives you access to layers of human experience that can only be reached through personal encounter with life's capacity for heartbreak. As you learn to honor your wound as teacher rather than enemy, something remarkable happens. The wound begins to transform from a source of shame into a source of strength, from evidence of your brokenness into proof of your resilience, from a liability you must hide into an asset you can share. The very experiences that once made you feel different and damaged now become the foundation of your unique ability to make a difference in the world. The 10th shift is complete when you realize that your wound and your gift are not separate things but different faces of the same diamond, not problems to be solved, but mysteries to be lived, not evidence of your unworthiness, but proof of your profound capacity to transform suffering into service. You understand that your wound is not something that happened to you, but something that happened for you, not a detour from your path, but the path itself, leading you toward the specific form of contribution that only you can make. In embracing your sacred wound as teacher, you discover that healing is not about becoming someone who has never been broken, but about becoming someone who has learned to create beauty from the broken places, strength from the struggled places, wisdom from the wounded places. Your scars become your credentials, your struggles become your curriculum, your healing becomes your gift to a world that desperately needs what only the wounded healers can provide.